Welcome to the Daoscape Arts Podcast. This is part 2 of a 3-part podcast titled The Living Word, recorded at Zarah Cafe with poet and educator Chris Nash in Beijing, China. Chris has been practicing creating Zen-inspired poetry for most of his life in the aim of integrating his audience more deeply with nature and with one another. This episode covers Chris's approach to including ancient Chinese and Indian cultural motifs in his artwork, a reading and a discussion of one of his Zen-inspired poems, a reading of a traditional Chinese Zen poem, and how poetry is taught in schools in Britain and China. So are there some particular ancient Zen or Taoist themes that you feel lend themselves to this work or that you bring out in your poetry?
The saying that I always start from is, the house is on fire, the door is open. And I think that pithily sums up my worldview, if you like, that we are in a world where we are constantly immersed in the busyness of everyday life, that there are so many things to which we have to be attentive, to which we have to give mind, but all the time, the mindfulness, the emptiness, the calm and peacefulness of mind, where we can be other, is constantly there. It's always there. If we can just flick the switch, you know, the door is open. And you know, I don't think I could ever lose my Buddhism because of the forcefulness, the truthfulness of that simple phrase.
Right. So do you also study maybe some ancient texts and things like that, you know, while you're practicing composing poetry?
Yeah, I try all my life not to be a follower, because I believe, you know, life is a journey that you make by yourself. But I guess Dr. Alan Watts has been a deep influence on me, and through both reading and listening to him, I try to update my understanding. I challenge myself all the time to make sure that my understanding is as deep as it possibly can be. What I do less of than I know I should is to go back to the original text. I'm starting to do a little bit more of that. But of course, there we come up with something that, you know, you've alluded to already, which is the elusiveness of language. And here am I, a Westerner, and using English as a way through into, you know, this wisdom. How authentic is what I'm hearing is a question that I have all the time. And so I guess the only way through that is for me to push myself and get closer in my own reading and understanding of Chinese, so that I can begin to hear the music. You know, I've already talked about the importance of music, and I don't hear the authentic music. I hear a version of it. It's like
an interpretation,
a badly tuned radio. Yep, I can hear it. I know it's real. I know it's there somewhere, but I'm not able to tune into it yet. And part of my practice, my devotion, if you like, my learning of Chinese, is to try and hear it authentically.
I just realised we had a plan for you to read one of your poems near at the beginning of the podcast. It doesn't really matter, I guess, when it comes.
Well, you can edit it any way you like.
Sure, but I'd like to keep it with a natural flow. But I was going to say, I saw one of your poems has Sanskrit included in it.
Yes.
Is there a particular reason why you chose to do that, or?
Well, because I think you've made a very good leap there, Tristan. Very good join, because I put Sanskrit, and increasingly I'm putting Chinese into the poems for, I think the right Chinese word is Dao, for authenticity, for hearing voices. And you know, this follows something I've tried to do all my life, which is to be a multilingual poet. So I was very close at one time to the Gujarati Indian community in the UK, and so I put in poetry which has Gujarati in there, Gujarati words, trying to reflect a multicultural society with a multilingual poetry. Now I'm in China, I'm trying to do the same thing. When I was in Italy, I wrote poetry with bits of Italian in.
Right.
So that's what I call, and it's on the front of my book, Poetry Without Borders.
Is that the title of your book? Sorry.
It's the subtitle, if you like. So the title is Songs of the Silk Roads. Of course, it's called Songs of the Silk Roads because I deeply believe that was a miraculous, momentous time in human history when all of these languages and cultures just flowed together, and out of that came Buddhism. Out of that came so many new understandings and new possibilities. So, a poetry without borders should build genuinely and authentically on as many languages as possible,
right,
and try to look for new understandings and new ways of being without all of the terrible walls which are springing up in our contemporary world.
Right.
Ahum.
Great, so maybe in a moment you can read us the poem where you've chosen to read today. Would you be able to give maybe a little bit of background?
Okay, so the poem is called Wind Mind, and it was composed in the mountains above Dali when I visited Dali in Yunnan province
in China, right?
2 years ago. And I went out of the town up into the mountains which surround it, and it was a kind of a Levi moment. I was away from the world. I was lifted up into the world of the Shan Shui, the mountains and the water. A very Ziran, natural moment, and immersed myself in the atmosphere, the trees, the feelings of being part of this natural world. It was just a really lovely experience. In many ways, I guess, connected with being a child. Remember back in Burley where I was wandering the forests?
Yes.
Well, here I was back in my natural environment, if you like. And there's the themes of Buddhism in there, the wind, the mind, which isn't fixed, the mind which is free. So I guess it's trying to give people a liberated mind, if you like, liberated to join nature. But I hope as well that always in my poetry is this dialogue between liberation and the world, effectiveness in the world, action in the world. One of the things that I'm deeply suspicious of in all religions is losing the connection with the world. I think that if we are truly living our spiritual life, then we are always looking to engage with the world and what's happening in it.
When you say the world, do you mean, because we could have like just psychological worlds, but when you say the world,
I mean
is
the real practical world,
right, the nature,
society,
right?
Society, and my poems always kind of wander off into nature and then come back to society, and I guess they try to find some sustenance, some energy from natural experiences to bring back, to share and to guide and to improve, develop, and deal with. So right at the end, you'll hear the rumours of war, which I think are ever present in our world. Right. And what I'm saying, or what I'm hoping, is that we can bring some peacefulness and mindfulness back from the experiences within nature, the deep connection with nature, to increase the peace. To use a very kind of cliche term. So shall I read?
Please go ahead.
Wind Mind. Okay. So the Wind Mind. The Wind Mind seeks to break free from teeming town below. The mountain path crawls intestine, winding with no destination. Leaves cascade in silvery evanescence from a spring sun. Songs of changes the forest weaves. Mountain breezes sound against silence. Sibilance of pine strings. The clear tones of icy streams over sobbing stones, not yet worn pure. As distant, unstoppable, the thudding of war. Shadows shifting, changing constantly. The mountain face You must not go. You must go. Thank
Nice.
you.
Thank you.
And I think that your listeners will appreciate the very pure Zen of the last part. You must not go. You must go. I hope that that has a koan-like nature in bringing us to a point of dilemma. Satori, a kick in the eye, a point at which we have to make a decision.
Right, interesting. So why do you say you must not go?
Yeah, because, so in one sense, it's so we've got this studying of war. The war is there all the time. Of course, the natural inclination would be to say, you must not go. You're here on the mountaintop. You've experienced this deep peace and tranquility. You want to stay, don't you? You must not go. You must stay here with this. But of course,
but in a way, you owe something to society. You've benefited from society. You must return to the dust and the chaos. Right.
It is a simple obligation, which is non-negotiable.
Sure. Very nice.
But hopefully, what I'm back to what I was saying about the immersive nature of poetry. That I don't just want to describe a dilemma. It's not a narrative. It's not telling a story. It's not descriptive. It's not explanatory. Hopefully, it's got some of that quality of great Chinese poetry. I'm thinking of. My master in poetry is Wang Wei. And it's
Could you say something about this person?
I can, yeah. Of what I experience from his poetry is this absolute immersion in the natural world. If we look at something like Deer Park, so simple. Lucid.
Would you be able to read it for the listeners? Do you have access to it? It's okay, you can look it up now.
You're going to have to give me a few seconds.
No problem.
Funnily enough, I was looking at it only this week and asked my friend how to give a Chinese reading of it. Wow. So I could actually share the proper Chinese reading with you. Okay, so I think we all know Wang Wei, Tang Dynasty poet, and the attraction there is that he also moved between two worlds. So he was part of the court society. He was a highly trusted administrator who made a lot of important decisions in society. But every chance he got, he would disappear into nature and immerse himself in Buddhism, and then come back and make some more important decisions. And that gives me, if you like, a metaphor or idea about the yin and the yang, the balance between these two important types of experience. And Deer Park is one of his most celebrated poems, and it's just 4 lines of utter purity. That's the only way I can express it. So let me see if I can find it for you.
I'm guessing it'll depend on which translation.
Yeah, well, that's where I try to find the purest expression. And as I say, what I did with this poem was to go back to the original Chinese, to try to experience it in the original Chinese, and then to get my friend to give me a Chinese reading so that I could actually hear the original language as well. Okay, so I'll try and give a reading in Chinese, and the lady over here will correct me and tell me how bad my pronunciation is.
Okay.
Kongshan Bo Jian Ren, Dan Wen Ren Yo Shang, Tan Ying Ru Shen Lin, Tu Zhao Qing Tai Sheng. That's something like the authentic Chinese. The translation that I have is this, and it's from a website called ChinesePoetry.com. And what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to give you a literal translation, because I think that literal translation gives you a feeling of what the Chinese is trying to do. So, Wang Wei, Deering, enclosure. Empty hill, not see person. Yet hear person voice sound. Return scene. Enter deep forest. Duplicate light green moss on. And that then we can translate into if you like, a transliteration. Hills are empty, no man is seen, yet the sound of people's voices are heard. Light is cast into the deep forest and shines again onto green moss.
Lovely.
Now for me, that is meditation.
Right.
Where one way moves us from the social world of voices into the natural world, dissolves us into the natural world, so we become the Tao, the Tao.
It's very
At the end of
nice.
that poem, that is what I believe he's done, to strip away our ego, our identity, our social being, and to bring us into the Tao, to help us to dance with the Tao, to do the Tao. By the end of that poem, we can do the Tao. And he's then brought that back and found the language, the words. Remember, in the Tang Dynasty, poetry was also song.
Right.
They were performed publicly, so you can imagine then an audience of people who were sharing this. Whether we call that community or not, I don't know. But
So that poem would have been performed as a song?
I believe so, yeah.
Right.
I mean, I don't have absolute knowledge of every detail, but I know that the roots of Chinese poetry are always song. And there are two poetic forms, both of which actually have origins in popular song.
Right.
Back to punk, popular
Right.
song.
Yeah, sure, right. Yeah. Amazing. Well, thank you for that.
And I hope that you can now see some little connections between that and my own Wind Mine poem.
Yeah, sure.
Where I'm also trying to strip away and immerse in natural experiences.
So you were saying that these poems are still appreciated in modern Chinese society.
Yeah.
I haven't come across it as much myself. Of course, I've met people who are fans of ancient Chinese culture, but quite often it seems Chinese people appreciate maybe Western, singer, Bob Dylan, this kind of thing. Do you think there are still poets today in China who are composing in the same tradition?
I'm not sure about the answer to that last question in the way that you've posed it. I know that through both Spittoon and ASPZ, I am meeting more and more practicing poets here in China, but I can't claim to any knowledge of a poetry scene or a poetry movement or anything like that.
Those two groups you've just mentioned are Beijing, are China-based groups.
Yeah. So ASPZ, a Shanghai poetry zine, is based in Shanghai, and Spittoon is the equivalent here in Beijing.
Right.
And what I like about both these things is that they are building this poetry or art without borders, looking for connections and crossing points between China and the rest of the world. But to try and answer the question, or at least the direction of the question you posed, I'm lucky enough to work in a Chinese school for children from kindergarten all the way through to age 18. And I can tell you absolutely that education in poetry and culture is absolutely at the heart of what we do, even though we are an international school. And we talk about, again, a kind of poetic thing that I made up for the school, that the children have their Chinese roots, but they bear international fruit.
Right. Oh, interesting.
And I think that kind of expresses what we're looking for. We work very hard through the education that we give to introduce them to Chinese culture, and then to build out from there connections with what we think is important in the West. So, for example, all of our students study A-level Chinese first language, and part of that is the study of poetry. And then the Chinese teacher and I collaborate, teach that. So the students develop insights and understanding from a Chinese tradition and then from a Western or international tradition. We're doing a lecture series of history where the Chinese teacher will look at the Shang, the Tang, a Chinese dynasty, and then I'll draw out from that connections with the rest of the world. So I think my answer is that certainly within my sphere of influence, we are keeping the voice and traditions of Li Bai, Du Fu, and many other poets alive and relevant. And my sense is that that's happening generally in Chinese culture. I mean, I've travelled in places like Yunnan, Gansu, and I've heard people on the street corner reciting poetry. I've been in conversations where people with a couple of lines of poetry will suddenly pop out. So I generally get the sense that poetry hasn't been locked away in libraries.
It's in the high school. I've heard it's in the high school textbook. The standard, there's the Han Shan Se poem, very famous classical poems, and then I think students are expected to learn them and recite them, right? I think that's part of their course.
I believe so. And I certainly get a very different feeling, just on a very simple level, when I talk to the children in my school or my colleagues about writing poetry. I think one of the differences is that I can do that here in China, and people don't think it's weird or odd. Whereas I know that if I was in my school back in the UK and I stood up at an assembly in front of the children and said, I'm going to read you a poem that I wrote last night, it would be chaos. I would be ridiculed. It would not be taken seriously. I would be labelled as some kind of weirdo freak. So I think that's part of why I feel much more comfortable, even now sitting here publicly talking about this. I don't feel odd, but I know that if you and I were in a cafe or pub back in England, people would have left by now,
or we'd be beaten up, maybe.
Or we'd be beaten up, or they'd be calling for an ambulance, because we needed to be put inside some kind of asylum as quickly as possible. Isn't that an awful thought?
It's very strange.
Isn't that an awful thought?
So you were saying in these groups, ASPZ and Spittoon, that there were Chinese people involved and Chinese people sharing their own poetry. Have you seen much coming from maybe a deep appreciation of Taoism or Zen flowing into those groups via those Chinese people, possibly?
I think the answer I'm going to give to that is yes and no. So, for example, one of the best poets in the ASPZ group is a Chinese, and interestingly for me, he's from a village background, and he writes so passionately and movingly about this experience again of transitioning between your home and your roots, your village identity, and what the city needs you to be or expects you to be, wants you to be, and the dual identities that involves. So I wouldn't say that he's trying to proselytize. He's not saying here's the Tao and this is why you need to follow the Tao, because of course as soon as you do that you've lost the Tao anyway, because that's the whole point. But I do believe that when I listen to him, I can hear that natural movement, that energy, that vision, if you like. And I'd like to believe, this may be a little romantic and a little bit weird perhaps, but I'd like to believe that because children in China are brought up through this culture and that they experience Wong Wei, Li Bai, a myriad of others at formative points in their lives, it kind of gets inside you. It becomes part of who you are. And I can only go back to listening to Anyhow Town when I was 14 years old, and that was kind of my Sartori. That was my, oh my God, the world is a weird place, but there's wonderful stuff I can do in it. I like to think that, you know, when children come across the tongue poetry, that it has a similar effect of culturing them in a particular way.
It does,
you know, even if they can't vocalize it, you know, and it's absolutely not just reserved for an elite.
Right.
You know, it's part of what every person in the country grows up with.
Well, isn't Chinese poetry just so much more kind of like almost painting a picture in your mind rather than kind of being clever with words, so to speak, isn't it? It's a bit more kind of direct into kind of like placing objects in your...
Yeah, that's pretty much what I understand. And one of the things I remember being just devastated by thinking about when I was discovering this stuff at 17, 18, is that, you know, Western poetry, take the Romantic poetry, any nature poetry, sets out to describe something and tell you what it's like. Chinese poetry says, no, we're not going to do that. Actually, we want to take you into this.
Right.
You know, you're not going to look at a mountain. You're actually going to go inside this setting. And as I've grown older, I've kind of experienced that more and more. And I can now see that if you look at, I mean, Wang Wei was a painter before he was a poet. You know, his watercolors, his landscapes at the time were much more celebrated than his writing. And if you look at these Shan Shui pictures, they're full of gaps, holes.
Space.
Yeah, space. Emptinesses for mindfulness. And I think that gives a very visual way of conceiving the poems, which are also full of gaps and emptinesses. And that's something that I think I put very much in my poetry as well. So back to that thing about there being no I, there being no narrative. There's no person seeing the world and describing the world for you. Look at this, look at this, look at this, look at this. I try to, in a similar way, just put people in the world full of the gaps and contradictions that the world is full of. Yeah, back to you must not go. Yeah, you must go.
Do you think that makes the poems more accessible? Do you think, you know, for the average Chinese high schooler, do you think it's like they do feel they are immersed in this poetic yet accessible environment, and that's something very...
From again, I can't generalize, but from my experience of working with students in the school, absolutely. You know, they don't come running down the corridor and saying, "Oh, this is just too weird, Mr. Nash. What's it mean? I don't get it." You know, there's none of that. I mean, even with students, I mean, a lot of our students are very mathematically orientated. You know, they're not creative thinkers; they're logical thinkers.
Yeah, very practical. Yeah.
Very practical. Yeah. I mean, they all want to be mathematicians, scientists, bankers, financiers, but they don't experience that kind of disconnect. And you know, remember, I've worked in classrooms in the UK for 25 years, and the business of trying to make poetry meaningful for English teenagers is incredibly difficult because there are so many cultural barriers to immersing yourself and experiencing poetry. And part of the reason for that, I'm sorry, I have to make this point very strongly, it's something I'm passionate about, is that we have in England this idea of a canon of great literature. You must read great literature. To be a civilized, cultured person, you have to read all this great literature. And Shakespeare's at the heart of it. And actually, I think that kills poetry.
Right.
It kills spontaneity. It kills spontaneity. Right. We don't come to poetry. We are brought kicking and screaming, dragged to poetry because it's going to be good for us. It's going to really make us into moral people. No.
This is the end of podcast 4, part 2, The Living Word with Chris Nash, which is continued in part 3 of this series.